Okay, Dane Rose here on an exciting topic, exploring a paradigm of understanding the self, understanding culture, understanding pain management within the general paradigm or topic of healing. What is healing? So let's begin. So perhaps the most important frame and space to begin is with the self. And we come in neutral. We come in with an essence, with a sense of who we are. And in human history, there have been literally 10,000 languages. And each language is associated with a slightly different culture. And if you travel the world, even today, in a frame in which culture is very largely homogenized, you will still find bizarre anomalies and large groups of people over here saying, well, it's completely obvious that this is the way to do it. And large people over here saying it's completely obvious that this is the opposite way to do it. Or even within one country, it's completely obvious that this is the political party or this is the political party. And what this suggests to me is that where we are born, and I see this mostly when you have a sense of meeting different family members who were raised in very different cultures, such as the Thai woman who I met who was raised in Australia, and she was the typical Aussie girl, kite surfing. And I'm like, what is a Thai girl doing kite surfing? You'd have to have spent some time in Thailand to understand what a strange anomaly this is. And she's like, oh yeah, I hate those Thai girls. They're so weak, it's so pathetic and all that. Of course I can kite surf. And yet, there's a 98% probability that or it's probably 99.9, that if she'd been born in Thailand and raised in Thailand, that she'd have no interest in swimming, because that's just the statistic here. So what I'm pointing at with this illustration is that who we think of as I or me is shaped dramatically by environment. And that this kind of essence of I or me can take tens of thousands of different shapes depending on the contexts that it encounters. This essence that's coming in that is me can speak French, can speak German, can be religious, can be atheist, can be a warrioress king, can be a priestess, can be a peasant, can be this type of person or that type of person, depending on the environment that's being that's influencing the development. And that it's neutral, leaning to light, leaning to consciousness, that if given a chance, if given a healthy environment to grow in, this essence of self will develop in a way that is beautiful. That there's a leaning towards beauty, towards truth, towards awareness, towards goodness, and that awareness itself is positively disposed, that you can actually measure in many ways the growth, the beauty, truth, and goodness in a culture by measuring the areas in the culture where awareness is welcome and fostered. That consciousness is predisposed to beauty, truth, and goodness, to borrow and reference Plato and his kind of pinnacle of kind of divinity. Now, into this kind of sphere or energy field, the culture inserts different objects that are foreign. And many of these objects are hostile to the self, meaning they are not attuned to the energy field of the individual. They are therefore hostile, invasive, denigrating, a little bit, as we find in the area of genetics and genetically modified foods. If you listen to some of the genetic engineers talking about how they get a plant to accept another gene, they'll talk about the way that they infect the plant with a disease that weakens the immune system of the plant, and then they insert a hostile gene into that environment. And in that particular state, the plant doesn't reject it, and they've forged a relationship and manipulated the organism into doing something it would not normally do. And the same is a little bit true of, human organ transplants, where they will at times use soy oil, which is an immune suppressant, to suppress the immune system long enough to do an organ transplant, etc., and make the change, before the immune system can reject it. And in a cultural sense, as these objects are inserted into the personal space, the child, the self, often responds with a protocol of rejection. This doesn't feel good. It's not attuned to me. I don't want it. Those reasons don't relate to me. This is out of sync with who I am. Now, this is followed by a protocol of shame, which is a trauma. And so the objects that are making their way into the personal field of the individual are packed with shame and trauma, like kind of explosive devices. And these objects, as they enter the field of the self, are themselves often traumatic. They don't feel good. They're not attuned. They're not optimal. They're uncomfortable. It's like sticking, metal hands inside the body. It feels creepy. It's a miserable feeling. And in order to get it to the protocol to continue, as the individual rejects, screams, etc., violence is applied in a consistent pattern that lets the individual know that these things may not be pleasant, they may not be good, they may not be attuned, they may not feel nice, but rejecting them, which is the healthy, urge of any individual, rejecting them results in a pain, in a shock that is much worse than accepting them. So the healthy rebellion, the healthy resistance of the self to this trauma of these foreign objects in the culture coming in is lashed back at in a variety of ways. One is abandonment, one is shame, one is violence, one is unregulated energy. There's physical violence, of course, but there's also rage, shame, hatred, intensity, because adults are giants relative to a child. And an adult can very easily convey in facial expressions, in energy, in the auric presence of the adult, the absolute hatred that they feel for the child that is not fitting in with the societal plan. Mother's got a great society dinner going on. The role of the child is to be demure, silent, smile pleasantly as the society wigs come around with their half-drunken gaze and have their little, revelry and discuss politics around the table. The whole thing, disgusting, out of alignment. The clothes, that look so pretty, etc., feel terrible. The blankets are, suffocating. The smells going on in the room bad. The auras of the people, unpleasant. The hypocrisy that's present. The whole thing is disturbing. In this particular analogy, to this child who begins to scream, begins to kick, trying to get out of it. Now, the person wants, the mother in this case, wants the child to play their role. She has no loyalty to that child. She has a usurious relationship. If the child makes her look good, and her points go up in society because she's got a good child, she will pamper, and there'll be a pact kind of with that child. If the child does the opposite and makes her look like someone to be avoided, she hates that child. She's either going to shame, punish, shake, abuse behind closed doors to try and get that child to be what she needs that child to be, so that she can use the child to go up in her social standing. And she will use violence, bribery, abuse, intensity, the threat, I will never speak to you again, I will leave you, I will punish you, you're never going to amount to anything unless you do this, you miserable loser, etc. All of these comments are designed to impress on the child that its reality in here doesn't matter, that its state is worthless, that its presence has no value in this world, that what has value are the little checks and the little check marks and X marks of a distorted and dissociated culture that the child happens to be born into. That if the child looks like this, if the skin color is like this or like this, that if the attitude is like this or like this, that if they overdevelop this trait rather than this trait, that they are good. And if they don't, they are bad. And sadly, there's no attuning the culture to the infant. It is a domination of the infant who is traumatically induced into the culture. Now, this creates a state of dissociation, meaning a foreign object is coming into the self. It feels absolutely horrible. As the individual tries to push it back out, to get it out of its space, violent trauma is directed at the structure of the self to warn it which is what all trauma is, that its life is in danger unless it accepts these objects, unless it learns this language, speaks in this way, behaves in this way, fits into this gender stereotype, fits into this racial stereotype, fits into this economic strata stereotype, fits into this business protocol, fits into the stereotypes of professional, fits into the ageism of the day. And this is so painful that the individual partitions. It basically says, okay, in order to survive, I'm going to let you stick all of these horrible structures inside of me. They don't feel good. They don't fit me. And the violence with which they are inserted feels barbaric. But you say you love me. I need you to survive. And you allow me to survive as long as I cooperate. It feels as painful as nails on a blackboard, as eating glass. It feels like shit. But I'll do it. I'll just partition this part of myself off. I will grimace and bear it. I will put a mask over the ache and the agony of this. And I will dissociate from the part of me that used to be here, that used to have feelings, and I'll let that part go numb. I'll dissociate and I'll let that part go numb. As an aside, whenever pets enter the lifestyle of a human being, the same pattern occurs. The pet has to conform into a certain culture in which it's arriving, dictated by the power structure of the adults. And when those energies inside the pet are not honored, the dog doesn't get enough walking, doesn't get certain discipline and cues as it might get, from an alpha male in a pack, it starts behaving in a variety of ways that don't fit into the structure, and there's a battle, which I was experiencing, making this video, battling with my dog, because I need a certain state in order to engage, in a video and be relatively coherent. The dog can and does destroy that state. We as adults need a certain state in our household or in our lives in order to operate our culture. When we don't have that state, we are penalized, shamed, ostracized, punished, etc. by the culture around us. The boss in most cultures doesn't care why you didn't get any sleep or why you didn't get the project done. They just care if you did or not. When this sociopathic pattern comes from above, from a sociopathic boss, from a sociopathic president, from a sociopathic power structure, from a sociopathic parent, the sociopathic state becomes infectious, and the sociopathic boss that will reward you if you get it done, and shame and punish and traumatize you, and by, for example, firing you if you don't, becomes internalized in the parent, who then becomes sociopathic towards the child, who now has to fit into this very narrow box so that mom or dad can get their project done. That the child cannot have feelings that day. The child cannot have space to do what they need or want, because it's all hinging on this sociopathic boss. And if there's any resistance around this, the parent, rails and shouts and, whatever. Don't you understand? If I lose my job, are you going to provide us rent? Shut the fuck up and go do your homework. I don't want to hear about any of these feelings. I've got to get stuff done. And now the sociopathic state has been transmitted from boss to parent, from parent to child, and sometimes from child to sibling. If that's an older sibling, it's very common to find then the older sibling humiliating and tormenting a younger sibling who needs something. And the older sibling's like, why should they get their needs met? Just because I can meet them, I don't want to meet their needs. I want to make them feel like me. And this is how sociopathic states, along with many other states, gets transmitted down the power structure. But this partition is created with dissociation. The dissociation leads to pain, a horrific pain, a confusing pain, a traumatic pain, the separation of self from self, the demonization of one part of the self, the deification of another part of the self. This part of the self becomes the dark enemy that in its suppressed, violated, shamed state begins to fester. It doesn't have the air that allows it to develop. Meanwhile, this self, which has sacrificed this self to the social power structure, gets deified, but also gets mineral deprived, so to speak. It's not being nourished by its counterbalance. It's getting overdeveloped. So there's an imbalance that develops. And the final part of this is called the coping mechanism. Now, the coping mechanism deals with the fact that this part of the self is in pain because it's out of whack with this part of the self. And the coping mechanism's job is to distract the healthy sense of self from the pain caused by the betrayed self, by the betrayed area of the self that has been turned over to a culture. Now, what could be so wrong with turning over to a culture? Aren't cultures great things, et cetera, et cetera. No culture in human history has ever been in balance, which means that every culture in human history, every culture is to varying degrees imbalanced in varying ways, which means that every culture throughout history, not existing in balance, is existing in a state of pain, in a lack of grace. Inserting that into what was a balanced self throws the self into this kind of self-perpetuating imbalance, which makes life harder and harder for the essential self. But then the way it is inserted, particularly in cultures that are not attuned to innocence, that are not attuned to the rhythms of the body, that are rather more and more dictated by the fixations of the mind, it is an imbalanced culture that is inserted violently, which simply means out of attunement with the organism it is relating to. This is painful when the self participates in it to survive. This is also confusing and painful because you have two types of trauma fighting each other. You have the trauma of the cultural wound, and then you have the trauma of feeling like you are the enemy if you fight the cultural wound. So there's the trauma of being violated, and there's the trauma of knowing that one will be shamed and ostracized, which is a trauma, if one does not participate in the violation. This is very, very difficult for the self to process, and it leads to this final partitioning in pain, which is called the coping mechanism, which is addiction and compulsion. So you know you're in this domain of kind of survival, etc., when you're dealing with addiction and compulsion. Now, here's the important thing to understand, that the function of addiction and compulsion is to distract from the cultural wound. It doesn't matter if the addiction is sex, it doesn't matter if it's alcohol, it doesn't matter if it's cocaine, it doesn't matter if it's pornography, it doesn't matter if it's work, it doesn't matter if it's goal achievement, it doesn't matter if it's therapy, it doesn't matter if it's being manic depressive, it doesn't matter if it's sugar, it doesn't matter if it's jogging, it doesn't matter if it's hyper competition. It doesn't matter what the compulsion is. The phenomena of addiction compulsion is a tensing of the muscles and a lack of relaxed presence. That's it. If you're having sex with a tensing of the muscles and an inability to relax and be present with the sexual act, it's compulsion. If going to work is I got to do this, it's compulsion. So this is the third element that takes up more personal space, is the compulsion that's managing the unhealthy invasion of the culture into the circular, balanced space of the individual psyche. Now, the function of a healer, what healing is helping the individual appropriately adjust these objects in its space, rejecting some, toning some down, reshaping others, so that the self can reclaim the full circle without shame, without dishonor, with grief for the wound and that loss, and in the process heal compulsion and addiction. This is the restoration of the personal space on the part of a healer. Now, the opposite takes place when you have a healer who has objects in their space that they are defending, because there is a defense that goes on as part of this dissociation. It can be denial, it can be lies, it can be a whole host of things. But in order for a healing patient to see the object that is inappropriate that's in their space, they also simultaneously see the same objects in the people around them. Now, when a healer is invested in protecting and masking an object that is a cultural object, a cultural wound, in their own space, they also are equally invested in their client, in their patient, not seeing the wound in their space. And in this situation, because the phenomena of healing is the phenomena of going back in time, which exist like rings of an onion, like rings of a tree. You can go back, 80 years in a tree and say, at 80 years there was this amount of water going on, etc., because if you count the rings of a tree that's been cut, you can learn about what was going on in the environment by the nature of the rings at that point. And so what all healing consists of is going back in time into that state of sacred innocence and sacred presence where the self was whole. Then coming forward in time where an unhealthy object was forced into the psyche of the self by an external power structure under the threat of trauma, shame, survival, etc. And clearing that out, letting the self know that power structure is no longer threatening the life of the child, clearing that object out. Then bringing the person back into the present to notice and integrate the fact that they are no longer in as much pain, which means that this part of themselves that has been screaming for their attention their whole life is now no longer the enemy. Because now when it screams for attention, it's saying, hooray, we've gotten rid of the object. Whereas before, when this part was screaming for attention, it was saying, there's a toxic thing in my space, there's a toxic thing in my space, please do something, there's a toxic thing in my space. And this self out here is saying, no, shut up, don't talk about that, because it's not safe. It's not safe to talk about the destructive object, because we'll be clobbered by the power structures around us that are invested in that object existing in themselves and in me. Now this part can say, hooray, there's no toxic object. Here I am, I'm the lost self that has been starved, shamed, hidden, etc. And we can begin a re-healing integration. And this is the process of healing. Once this happens, to the degree that the self is reclaimed and honored, the pain goes down by that exact percentage. With it, the coping mechanism for managing pain, which is compulsion and addiction expressed in a whole variety of forms, goes down by equal proportions. The self is now stronger because it's not fighting itself to protect a diseased and imbalanced power structure. So this is the essence of healing. And in the worst possible cases of that, you go back into innocence, for example, with the use of psychedelics, which force that. You go back into that deep innocence terrain, and rather than objects being pulled out of the self, new objects are put in by the quote healer, or reinforced by the quote healer, and you come out in more pain without realizing it and without understanding it. Because this whole self out here that's outside the wound has always been aligned with keeping this part locked up and partitioned, because it's in alignment with the cultural abusive dynamic. Because there's a deal. There's a deal with this part and the culture. And this part basically sacrifices a part of itself to stay alive. And this part of the culture demands the sacrifice. And as long as the majority of the self abides with the contract, the majority of the self is rewarded. But it tells, you can tell how much a culture demands of its citizens in terms of this sacrifice. You can tell how much the sacrifice is by the amount of disease, mentally, emotionally, and physically, by the amount of energy. You will have an exhausted culture when you have to spend half of your energy fighting your other half, which you're trying to suppress to keep the cultural objects in place. So this is a good way to measure the health of a culture. The health of a culture that is very healthy is a population that is alive, clear in their body, without compulsion, without trauma and fear of trauma, that is protecting the innocence and the sacredness of that innocence. in themselves and in everyone around. A peak healthy culture, anyone raises a hand and says, I'm scared, I'm in danger, I don't know what to do, and there is immediate protection mentally, emotionally, physically for that individual. In an unhealthy culture, you have exhausted, overextended people that are divided, and there's this phenomena of sabotage where one part of the self seems to be erupting and having a tantrum. That sabotage is the suppressed, denied part of the healthy self that is containing the cultural objects that don't really belong in a healthy self so that it can survive. And when it keeps getting the message, just shut up another decade, shut up another decade, once we get through college, once we get through this, finally you'll get a voice, and never does. It starts betraying, it starts sabotaging this part that's in league with the culture. So I hope you've enjoyed this overview. I found it very helpful as I'm kind of muddling through, as most of us do, this terrain of healing the self, culture, pain, and addiction.